I will make this presentation extremely short. Basically, I will just introduce Davor Džalto to the theme. We don't need no education, the fate of academia in the age of global capitalism. I have not read this lecture in advance. I don't know what he will say, but most probably he will say something that will spark our interest for a discussion after the lecture. And if not, I will spark some interesting questions. So, but I leave, in fact, the floor quite open to Davor, but with one addition. Now, we are facing a time where people have more or less direct access to their international reading of the world, meaning simply that we pick up a mobile phone and we can even send an information to Serbia or other parts of the world. The theme, global capitalism, the idea of globality or the global society is quite interesting, and therefore I leave the floor open for, or the floor open, not the screen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael. Thank you all for coming to this lecture, which this way or the other, the topic is, I think, relevant to all of us, especially teachers and administrators, but also many other people who are this way or the other linked to education at various levels of the system of education, but primarily I'll be focusing on the higher education, so the context I'm directly involved in, and I think I know better than many other contexts. So I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, although it will take some time to go over a couple of things. And really the purpose of this presentation is, as Michael said, just to inspire later discussion and not to present some kind of very well-shaped arguments or theses or conclusions, but rather to open some questions and propose one or two ways in which we can think of the issues related to education nowadays and the problem of global capitalism. Now, of course, technique always poses some issues, but I think it's working now. So first of all, why this topic? I think we all feel, if not something more conscious, that there is a certain crisis with the system of education, and also a closely related crisis, and that's the crisis of the public sphere. And both of these crises, or both of these changes, actually do have an effect on democracy and also how we understand education, its purpose, its structure, and so on. And I'm glad also that we have politicians among us who actually can do something about some of the points that I'll raise. And I wanted to quote Collingwood and his famous observation long time ago, 1940, but still very relevant, maybe even more relevant than before. Although Collingwood reduces the issue we're facing to European science and European civilization, the fate of European science and European civilization is at stake, says Collingwood. The gravity of the peril lies especially in the fact that so few recognize any peril to exist. Where Rome was in danger, it was the cackling of the sacred geese that saved the capital. I am only a professorial goose consecrated with a cap and gown. I don't have cap and gown, but it applies. You know. And fed at a college table, but cackling is my job, and cackle I will. And I think we need more than just cackling, but even that is a good start. And of course, the title of this presentation is derived from famous Roger Waters' song, Another Brick in the Wall, where actually this call or proclamation, we don't need education, we don't need no education, is kind of explained already in the next line by the words, we don't need no thought control. That there was an understanding, and this time in many ways when the song was written, was actually facing the issue of thought control or control in general in various societies. And it was one of the critical points when many of Western societies went through significant processes of, at the same time, democratizations, but also very much new restrictions that were imposed both on the public sphere and also on the system of education. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But also I wanted us to remember another song even earlier, which actually summarizes what's the purpose of education, of the school system in many countries. And Pete Seeger, his in those famous song, I hope you heard it, asks those questions. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? And then the answer is, I learned that Washington never told a lie. This is, of course, from a US context, but I think it is applicable to many other contexts, many other societies. I learned that soldiers seldom die. I learned that everybody's free, and that's what the teacher said to me. That's what I learned in school today. I learned also that policemen are my friends. I learned that justice never ends. I learned that murderers die for their crimes, even if we make a mistake sometimes. That the government must be strong. It's always right and never wrong. Our leaders are the finest men, and we elect them again and again, and so on. In other words, it points to a very acute problem, and that problem is something that has been thought over and fought against over many centuries in the Western civilization, of how the system of education is under pressure or interfered with by various power structures, and primarily by state coercion or state power structures. But of course, that's not the only source of coercion, and that's certainly not the only source of problems with higher education or education as such. And most things that I'll present today, at least in their basic outline, you can find in these two publications. One small one, an article, you can easily read it if you're interested in that, published in 2018 in Dissident Voice, on this issue of neoliberalism and academia, and also partly in this book that recently just came out that addresses the issue of capitalism as such, problem of capitalist ideology, and of course the problem of education within this framework. Now, so the presentation basically is about the public sphere and education, and how we can think of these two things, their mutual connections, at the time when most societies, and one could claim all societies, actually started to various degrees operate based on a default ideology that's called capitalism. I define public sphere simply as the sphere where the discussion of matters relevant for the life of the political community takes place, and that's also the sphere where things that are relevant for the lives of virtually all or overwhelming majority of people who live in that community, what's relevant to them. So this is the distinction between public and private sphere, where private sphere is something that is not of a general concern. And of course this definition is not a very precise one, because I don't think actually that in matters such as this society, complicated things, you can actually come up with two precise definitions without ending up in some kind of nonsense. But it is specific enough to actually differentiate between what is relevant and what is not. And if you just think about this already in these very general terms, you'll actually see that what we see in the media when you go on social networks, also mainstream media, traditional ones, ask yourself, is it what you see there, what you hear there of general importance? Is it something that, is most of the information that are spread around them something that genuinely relevant for the life of the political community? You know, I'll leave it to you to think about it. And of course, this is related to one of possible definitions of the public sphere. You can find in literature many of these definitions go back to Habermas, and I don't want to refer directly to Habermas because I have many issues with Habermas, so I just want to put it like a footnote, and we can discuss this later. But I think the general picture is specific enough so that we can actually meaningfully use the term public sphere. And what is actually a process that we witness not only today, but actually over many decades now, is that precisely this sphere is being more and more privatized. And this, of course, raises some issues. It is becoming privatized, private sphere, by the overwhelming influence of corporate private interests, primarily big businesses, that engineer a desirable public opinion. And you find in a lot of literature on the public sphere and liberalism especially, they always will tell you how public opinion is important, and that public opinion is supposed to be the basis for making legitimate democratic decisions, that the government should take that into account. But they rarely tell you how public opinion is engineered, or, to quote from another author, manufactured. That public opinion is not something, unless you have something we could call genuine public sphere. Public opinion is normally, and you can find that in authoritarian regimes as well as in so-called democratic regimes, is engineered. And it's primarily engineered partly by government agents, but mostly by PR industry, and they do reflect private interests, those who are actually holders of real money in the Western world, and that's big businesses. Then themes that are discussed in the public sphere actually do not reflect genuine interests of the majority of the population. They most of the time reflect private interests, so that the public sphere is actually turned into a private one while pretending to be a democratic, open, and free. And that, of course, takes us back to the liberal paradigm and liberal thought, where democracy is, in the most of the manifestations of mainstream liberalisms, understood as something that needs to be handled carefully. Something that cannot be just let to people, because otherwise it can get very dangerous. And that's the distinction that sometimes is made between liberal democracy and radical democracy. So most people nowadays, it's a routine when you hear the word liberal democracy, everybody thinks, oh, it's something nice, it must be democratic, it's so over the place. But rarely anybody tells you that the Council of Liberal Democracy was inaugurated precisely in opposition to something that to me seems as a much more democratic tendency, which was labeled as radical democracy, something that actually should be stopped. One of the reasons, or primary reasons, if you ask me, why it's liberalism ended up being an enemy of authentic democracy is that it became an ideology of big business and the elite sector of society. And this is directly related to the kind of education or educational paradigms we want to develop, we want to nurture, we want to have within this school, this society, or globally. And this is a very complicated problem and complicated history, and there is certainly no time to go into that, but just as an outline, I can give you a couple of these famous names from that history. Of course, Humboldt and Humboldtian understanding of education and higher education, which revolves around the concept of disinterested research, which shouldn't be directly under an impact of political or economic or other factors, and also about research, modern understanding of research and teaching, and freedom of research and teaching, so that the state shouldn't directly interfere with what happens at universities in terms of teaching and research. But also there is Newman, who affirms his idea of liberal education as something that is supposed to cultivate the intellect. And all of this, of course, is directly related to the Enlightenment ideas of the reason, mind, and of course, how their purpose is envisioned. One problem with many of these approaches throughout the 19th century and also much of the 20th century was that a certain concept of objectivity penetrated what's called science, and it's most of the time it represents a positivist adaptation of a general method of positivism into the humanities. And so very often you hear in the tradition, especially of European education, that universities are supposed there to be something that deals with objectivity and objective knowledge. We could make a couple of presentations to explain how meaningless that is. Objectivity, if you just start thinking about it for 5 seconds, you'll end up seeing that there is no much point in even using this concept. But for a lot of time, even nowadays, it is used, and it is most of the time used actually to mask real willingness to seriously engage with academic enterprise, and very often sometimes to effectively sideline additional approaches that are devalued or marginalized because they are supposedly not objective, and academic research is supposedly objective. And we can, of course, think about what's the purpose of education, or what's the purpose of university. And you have, over this history, a couple of centuries of modern universities, many different answers to that question. And it's not even, I'm not sure that it's even consistent in Humboldt or Newman as much as it seems. Because you can always ask yourself, is the purpose of education to get to, let's say, the pursuit of truth, whatever that is, as it is what you can find in Humboldt, in some kind of impartial or objective way, without pressures from external entities such as government or businesses? Well, I think many people would say nowadays, well, it would be good, to have that kind of education. But at the same time, many people at the same time think that the purpose of higher education is also to promote democracy, for example, as a model. And these two thoughts are mutually exclusive. So if you believe that education is about objective truth, objectivity, and shouldn't be under direct influence of some ideological paradigms, then you can't at the same time believe that it should be about promoting democracy. These mutually are exclusive. So, but most of the time, people actually never get that far to think about these basic premises. What is the purpose? What is that we want from a university education? And of course, we witness, it's good that there is a clock there, so I don't go on for too long. Actually, does anybody know how long should this presentation go on? Huh?
We will find out during the way. Okay, good. Good. I'll try to finish like in 20 minutes, so we have at least half an hour for discussion. So we clearly see a shift sometime during the latter part of the 20th century between traditional education, let's say traditional modern system of education, we're not talking about pre-modern systems, and what is sometimes called market-oriented university. And there are many in literature that deals with these issues, many different explanations proposed for this. So the story usually roughly goes like, okay, there is Humboldt, and there's this early 19th century and later, like Newman, 19th century thinkers, and there's the formation of the liberal arts academia, and this is the paradigm. And then there is a shift sometime after World War II, let's say in the 1970s, that actually move away from those paradigms defined by Humboldt
about free research, pursuit of truth, and so on, into something else, something much more market-oriented, and very often the words that are used are also socially responsible, and so on and so forth. And some claim that the change came as a result of reduced state funding, which in itself came as a result of the crisis of 1970s, primarily in the United States. And that just simply by reducing state funding, universities were forced to go out and search for additional sources of money, which of course necessarily linked them with those who had the money, and that means corporations. Then there is also an explanation, mostly in literature, that actually is sympathetic to market-oriented universities, that there is a growing need for better facilities, equipment, academic resources, and it's just natural that at some point universities started to actually seek for additional sources because there's just not enough of state support. Some also say that there was a need for professional administrators to help with fundraising and develop better administrative methods, so to change universities that they could better fit the changing needs of the university, but also the needs of society. And finally, many see in this act change legislation in the US, which in many ways is paradigmatic for the Western Hemisphere, and the changes that happen there usually just spill over throughout the rest of the world, and especially the Western world. And that is the law that enabled universities to own and commercialize inventions. So what happens at the university, patents that are developed using state money were allowed now to be actually sold or made contracts with companies, individual companies, for profit, which of course linked intimately certain segments of academia with big businesses. But there are also, I would claim, ideological reasons for this. And this, of course, coincides with the rise of what is sometimes called neoliberal era from the 1970s on. And a very good source to understand this is this report by three important academics from 1975, and Huntington would become much more important and famous later on the crisis of democracy. Now, I ask you to be very careful now to pinpoint together what the crisis of democracy in 1979 was about in the perception of these authors. And this report, by the way, was done for the Trilateral Commission. So as a part of the effort to rethink kind of big global strategy, how to connect North America, Western Europe, Japan as most advanced industrial societies, and think about the role of education there and also democracy. And by the way, this represents the liberal end of the spectrum, not some kind of very conservative right-wingers. I'll give you a couple of citations, and I know it's never too wise to have too much text on PowerPoint, but here just a couple of them so that you can actually see what those reports, what this report is all about. Democracies can work, according to the authors, provided their publics truly understand the nature of the democratic system. So, they need to truly understand. Yeah, we could, I suppose, agree to that. But then there is more. The image which occurs in these and other statements they quoted above is one of the disintegration of the civil order, the breakdown of social discipline, the debility of the leaders, and the alienation of citizens. That is what they perceive in the mid-1970s. And if you just remember what actually happened less than a decade before, with major protests, 1968 and so on, this is a direct reaction to that. There was too much of a challenge to the existing system. Advanced industrial societies, they perceive, has spawned a stratum of value-oriented intellectuals, and now read carefully what's their great sin, who often devote themselves to the derogation of leadership, the challenging of authority, and the unmasking and delegitimation of established institutions. This development constitutes a challenge to democratic government, which is potentially at least as serious as those posed in the past by the aristocratic cliques, fascist movements, and communist parties. Liberal end of the intellectual spectrum, also closely associated with some of the most prominent members of the liberal elites in North America. In 1960s, 1960s witnessed a dramatic renewal of the democratic spirit. The predominant trends of that decade involved the challenging of the authority of the established political, social, economic institutions, a reaction against the concentration of power in the executive branch of the federal government, and in favor of the reassertion of the power of Congress, and so on. So you can see all these processes that were taking place, a renewed commitment to the idea of equality on the part of intellectuals and other elites, the emergence of public interest lobbying groups, and so on and so forth. People no longer felt the same compulsion to obey those whom they had previously considered superior to themselves in age, rank, status, expertise, character, or talents. Authority based on hierarchy, expertise, and wealth all obviously ran counter to the democratic and egalitarian temper of the times, and during the 1960s, all three came under heavy attack. Of course, the problem is the educated people, because they are more likely to participate in politics, to have a more consistent and more ideological outlook on political issues, and to hold more enlightened or liberal or change-oriented views on social, cultural, and foreign policy. Now, this is also interesting. Smith once remarked that the only cure for the evils of democracy is more democracy, but the authors here disagree. Their analysis suggests that applying that cure at the present time could well be adding fuel to the flames. Instead, some of the problems of governance in the United States today stem from an excess of democracy. Needed instead is a greater degree of moderation in democracy. So let's moderate democracy. There is already too much democracy, not have more of that evil. And they also cited there the importance of particular institutions. There you can find schools, but they could have also just added universities as well. In their words, those institutions that have traditionally played a major role in the indoctrination of the young in their rights and obligations as members of society, their understanding of society, have been the family, the church, the school, and the army. And those have failed to do what they were supposed to do, to indoctrinate the young. So, question is, should a college education be provided generally because of its contribution to the overall cultural level of the populace and its possible relation to the constructive discharge of the responsibilities of citizenship? If the question is answered in the negative, then higher educational institutions should be induced to redesign their programs so as to be geared to the patterns of economic development and future job opportunities. And you can see here, in spite of all these other factors that might have influenced the change, we have here clearly stated ideological program. To their credit, they were very plain about all of this. They didn't try to hide this. The report was for the Trilateral Commission, but in the same year, 1975, it was published as a book by New York University Press. So ever since, it's been available so that people can think about what is plainly stated as a diagnosis of the problem. And this is what gave rise to education or university education in the era of neoliberalism, which is characterized by the process of corporatization of universities. That universities are becoming more and more, in the United States, it's now been a long history, it's changed completely, university culture, but in Europe that also is at a very advanced stage, turning universities into corporate-like entities. more managers, more obedience, less freedom, and so on. Understanding of education as an industry, just as other industries. Market-oriented education. So forget about even Humboldt, and freedom of research and teaching. What should be there taught at university should be just for the market. And of course, that's the capitalist obsession. Let's turn everything into market-like entities and proclaim market the only ontologically relevant factor. The consumer type of education. Education understood as a commodity. Students are treated increasingly as customers and consumers. They are there to be happy. Teachers are there to make them happy. And especially if you have less and less teachers who are employed with tenure, so on a permanent basis, and they depend on student evaluations, then of course, and there is the pressure of the dictatorial managers, then of course what you'll get is increase of high grades and fall of actual education and the outcomes of education. This is also mirrored in the rise of for-profit universities throughout the world. Europe has still been doing quite well in that respect compared to many other parts of the world, but we still have in Europe increase of for-profit universities, and also some traditional universities are forced to turn themselves into some kind of for-profit universities. This is linked with higher cost of education, primarily North America and English-speaking world in general, which by now has skyrocketed. The growth of the university administration, the managerial model, and whoever is familiar with some of the major or any major actually university in the States knows the bizarre thing that tens, dozens of various managers, and nobody can tell what they do, occupy high-level places for spectacular salaries, and at the same time, the universities, of course, minimize the costs for teachers and for research. Of course, they raise money to make fine facilities like sports facilities or vending machines, all of those essential things for a good education, but research, education, teachers, let's forget about that as much as we can. Part of that problem, not directly coming out of this managerial model, but part of a broader problem that mirrors changes within liberalism as an ideology, is also the culture of political correctness, disclaimers, trigger words, which actually even more reduces freedom within the university and within the classroom. If you are in an English-speaking university, you can very easily nowadays find yourself out of the job if you say one word that somebody finds whatever insulting or something like that. So that prevents any possible meaningful discussion within the classroom. So the idea of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, is something that we apparently in most places have given up in the Western Hemisphere. So it's very easy to complain about, what happens in China or, Putin's Russia, but we rarely actually ever think about tremendous negative changes and pressure and oppression that we are exposed to in the Western Hemisphere. So this education in and for the neoliberal system is usually understood as a training. So you're just supposed to get certain skills that will get you a job, and that of course is something very beneficial for the corporate sector, not, I would claim, for society or for individuals. Research is supposed to fulfill short-term goals that either reflect government interests, like let's invent more sophisticated technology to survey the general population, for example, or how to use the same thing to get more and more data for business interests. But then if the system of education in the humanities is good, under quotation marks, it also functions as a quality indoctrination, because if you go through such a system of a neoliberal academia, what you internalize is obedience. You are supposed to learn how to behave in the classroom, which is what you will find in a corporate environment. So within a certain ideological paradigm, certain freedoms are allowed, such as freedom, for example, to say, okay, I'm insulted by this or that word. But where you get much more obedient is internalizing the business logic. You are overworked, you don't have time actually to think, you follow pretty stylized syllabi, and what gets you through the education and what gets you good grade is obedience. If you follow the rules, if you don't raise many questions, you can end up fine and get a job, maybe. But if you start raising questions, if you start thinking about problematic issues, or start reading something that's not on the reading list, that can get you into a deep problem. And one of the means of this indoctrination is, of course, student loans, that in the English-speaking world are a huge problem for the student, because you cannot afford to be out of a job. You end up with huge loans that need to be repaid. That's the primary concern, not the well-being of society, of human beings, or concerns of research. And finally, this type of a system of education has led in some parts of the world. This is not so much, or rather it wasn't so characteristic of the developed world, but now it's becoming more and more present in the developed world, is something that I call the low-budget indoctrination, for the lack of a better word. That's in mostly what we used to call third world countries, where universities really serve simply to either get the money, if they're privately owned, offering nothing really, no education, or even state universities that have given up on any kind of serious academic research, where they're partly forced by the state to lower the standards so that both teachers and students can actually produce any kind of nonsense, as long as there is a production of some publications that you can put on your CV that looks good and can get you a promotion, for instance, it's fine. So this is really a tremendous fall in the quality of education, and a major change in the very understanding of what university is all about. Because once you get the university to that level, then the general population can rightfully ask, why do we even need this university? Can't we just simply get rid of it, because it doesn't really fulfill any meaningful service to society? And they're right. That kind of university really doesn't serve any meaningful purpose to society. They're better than to just be closed down or reinvented. And that leads me, and I'll just briefly summarize a couple of points where I think we ought to think about a different kind of education, which will, of course, keep high standards of competence and professionalism, because that is needed in all these realms, both in research, but also society needs people who are competent in what they do. But also general education or general culture against what in German is called Fachidioten, or the idiots of the profession. So those who are actually unable to think outside of a very limited scope they have been trained in, because that poses serious problems, again, both for academia and research and for society. A vital part of a higher education, meaningful higher education, should be the development of critical thinking skills. And everybody nowadays talks about critical thinking skills, and there is less and less critical thinking. So that kind of typical capitalist inflation of everything, including the use of certain concepts, demeans those concepts. But it is vital, critical thinking, as the ability to question the established framework, no matter where. Within a certain academic field, within society, within academia, our working space, and so on and so forth, is vital, because only that is our instrument we can counterfight the rising totalitarianism. And of course that has impact both within, strictly speaking, academic environment and in society. And what I also think has mostly been forgotten is the significance of education for personal development. That it is not, its purpose is not, cannot, should not be to satisfy just all these other needs. It needs to be something related to who we are. Because, as many people have said that already, if you read a book and that book has not changed you, it was pointless reading it. So if you're just going to read it for the sake of satisfying some external needs, I think that's a very, very poor understanding of human enterprise, and also a very poor outcome and diminished human lives. And how to get there, how to get to the point where we actually can put some of these principles in practice, well, that is difficult. That's the difficult part. Because the situation is, in spite of what politicians, tell us, and mainstream media, it's, oh, the future will be glorious, or it will be bright. Well, maybe with a couple of nukes it will be very bright. We are in very deep problems, and it's not a joke, and I don't think there are easy solutions. We need to reaffirm freedom of expression and thought, both in societies and academia, and these are under major assault. Again, not just in some distant or autocratic regimes, they are throughout the Western Hemisphere, here, and everywhere throughout Western Europe, North America. Try to say certain things that are not on the party line, the established media discourse, and you'll see what the consequences are going to be. Freedom of research and teaching, directly counter to the neoliberal model, where we are supposed to teach and research on what somebody else designs for us. That's an insult to us as human beings and researchers. But we accepted the situation. We accepted a situation where we are obedient servants to the power, and we rarely actually raise our voice or try to do something about it. Sometimes because it's just much more comfortable that way. You get your salary or something and just shut up, and the system continues working. That cannot be done without a reaffirmation of the concept of democracy. And most of the time when we listen nowadays about democracy, it's everything but a meaningful concept of democracy. Democracy and the whole democracy discourse, also human rights discourse, reminds me nowadays of the role of Marxism in the Soviet Union. So you're supposed to talk about Marx ideas, to cite Marx everywhere, to say it's all about communism, all of that. But the purpose of that was precisely to undermine the leftist dimension and the potential of leftist ideas within authoritarian societies such as Soviet, for instance. So you use the language of the left-wing ideas in order to actually prevent from any authentic leftist ideas being put into practice. That's exactly the same nowadays with the discourse on democracy. We talk about it, but actually we don't do it. We don't implement it. There is less and less democracy and less of human rights, again, in the West, and of course we know that that's the case in other regimes that don't even pretend to be democratic. One of those things that has been tried and worked quite good, that is a way to understand authentic democracy, is self-management. And that was part also of the Humboldtian idea of universities. It can be revived, it should be revived, but it can also be applied generally throughout society. Without self-management, talking about democracy is just a charade. If you don't have lower decision-making, if you don't have those who are affected by certain decisions to directly participate in the decision-making process, there cannot be any meaningful talk of democracy only within this liberal paradigm that I quoted to you. Okay, then we end up with things like, okay, there's too much democracy, we need to actually limit it. Freedom from the coercion of both the state and the business sector or the market. But also this is very difficult to do without the public recognition of the significance of education, research, and knowledge. That's a major problem, because if we go back to what I said at the beginning, the public sphere, authentic public sphere, is disappearing, and in most cases it has completely collapsed. Public funding, precisely in order to prevent those private interests to shape academia and also the public discourse. Accessibility of education, which again has declined in the West significantly compared where it was. In some cases, it is advanced because certain sectors of the population that previously were excluded are now included. But in terms of the availability, because of the rising cost in many Western countries, the actual accessibility of good education has been falling. And the responsibility of the actors within the academic community precisely for academic freedom, freedom of research, and these ideas. Because we are still privileged within academia much more than average workers. And I think it is a very indecent thing if we behave in an obedient manner, completely subscribing to the power positions, because we still have an opportunity or some channels to use to raise our voice and try to change this, what I think is a dramatic situation. But none of this really will work unless we find ways to overcome and finish with capitalism as probably one of the most destructive forces in human history. Now, how to do that is even more complicated question and a topic for some other presentation, so I won't bother you with that more. Thank you for your attention, and we still have some time for your discussion if you have it.
Yeah. I open up the floor for questions first of all, and then to give our perspectives or discuss with Davor. So,
comments, questions, impressions, whatever.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think we recognize a lot of things that you talk about here. Let me go back to your introduction about the crisis of the public sphere. Would you say, to me it sounds as if you think that originally there was a public sphere that was not shadowed by interests, etc., etc. But has it ever been so nice that we tend to like?
Yeah.
If I may say so. I mean, the interests that you describe as business interests, yes, but they are technologically defined, I think, in a way, and that's all fine to think along those lines. But how was it 50 years before, 100 years before? Who was printing the books? Who were the owners of the newspapers? Who could read? Who had the word in the public sphere? How idealistic can we be about that?
Yeah. No, thank you for that. You're completely right. So it's not about okay, the loss of some imagined paradise, because there was no such paradise. But a major difference is that in theory that we can find on public opinion and public sphere, the situation was different in the liberal thought. If you go back to even the 18th century or 19th century. So what we see now is a change where the public sphere really is, first of all, dominated by private interests, which was not the case before. It was dominated by some other interests. It was dominated by the state, for instance, or it was dominated by the major ideology or the major party in some cases. Nowadays, that changed, and I'm not also sure that it was the same kind of limitations imposed on the public sphere before. If we go back to, let's say, prior to World War II in Western countries, the major, I would say, source of oppression against the public sphere, or the limitations put on what gets into the public sphere, was self-censorship. That actually people in certain positions would prevent things from getting into the public sphere because that wouldn't actually be the way they think without necessarily external coercion. And that was very well understood as the primary difference between democracy, so-called democracies, and authoritarian regimes, because you need to cultivate sensitivity of self-censorship so that certain people who actually have access to the public sphere do not use it in the wrong way, as opposed to authoritarian regimes where you just don't get that chance. So I think what we have here is the shift, that the possibilities that were there, the lack of private control. So the fact that, for example, in many countries, all the mainstream media are controlled by a couple of corporations, or in some cases it's even one major factor behind them. That actually is a situation that was not in many societies, didn't function like that before, without idealizing it at all. But what is very worrying now to me is that you have actually a scholarship and you have ideology, and it's called liberalism, and it's called liberal democracy, which actually advocates for the public sphere, which is not a public sphere. So that in a certain sense we are presented both with a theoretical conceptualization of the public sphere, which eliminates the possibility of a public sphere, and in actual reality we have most of the time private tyrannies more or less predominantly influencing the public sphere. So I should also add that, of course, we have other channels of communications that we didn't have before, so we can use them, but again, through the way in which algorithms are used, that is also in actual reality a very much narrower space than it seems.
More questions or comments? Ann-Kristin?
What about censoring? The censorship. I'm not talking about the public one, because the academia is supposed to try to push the walls, but I'm talking about the self-censoring that I think we're doing today in academia. Mm-hmm. What would you say about that in the context?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think that's in many ways a major problem. It's interconnected, because if you, for instance, create in society or in academia or anywhere, if you create an atmosphere where speaking freely is potentially dangerous, that leads to self-censorship. So, in other words, that's one obvious choice why people actually go and why they'll self-censor themselves, because they just don't want to run the risk of suffering certain consequences, various consequences. It doesn't need to be, just like, I mean, they kill you sometimes, but it doesn't need to be that. You lose your job, or you whatever, or you end up on social media, you are exposed to cancel culture, or whatever of these meaninglessnesses nowadays, and they really harm people. So that's one I see there one source of self-censorship, but that's not the major problem, because in that self-censorship, people still think differently. So they just choose not to speak their mind because they're afraid of the consequences. And this is much more, used to be traditionally the case in authoritarian regimes. Nowadays it's all over the place, and even in many ways it's more typical of Western societies. But another much more dangerous and difficult phenomenon of self-censorship is when people do not even think differently. So when they are actually so much indoctrinated, or choose some similar word, but that's what it means, they absorb so much the dominant ideas and values that are in the so-called public realm, which, as I explained, has been to a great extent privatized, that they don't actually think differently. So, in a certain sense, it's a censorship of ideas that do not penetrate into the public realm, because those who could bring them into the public realm are not exposed to them and don't actually have any contact with alternatives that could make them change their mind and act differently. So maybe it is like an exaggeration of using the same concept for both. But in any case, it's a problem when someone who has potentially at least an opportunity to say something which counters the established narratives does not do that. Either chooses consciously or just doesn't do that because they essentially share the value system, or somebody told them that and they just choose to obediently follow it. And in academia, it's dramatic. I mean, most of the scholarship, when you start reading it, especially in the humanities, is appalling. You know, just like you have one mantra, you have one fancy concept, and then production of millions of books on the same thing, you know, over and over again until something else penetrates. It's just bizarre, but you know, that gets you positions, you know, that because nobody bothers even to read, and that's called our intellectual life, I'm afraid, nowadays.
So I would like to first thank you for this wonderful talk. It was very stimulating, and especially for me as an academic who sold my soul to the military-industrial complex.
You are among the bad guys.
I would like to challenge you a little bit and say that yes, education is in a bad state, but there are institutions where education is at a top level. And I have worked in some of them, but they're closed to the public, and nobody knows. So I was thinking, like, what is the relationship between these closed elite institutions that, you know, they do get the best products from public universities, private universities, those who work in the public sphere. So I was thinking, like, listening to you, maybe there is this systematic undermining of education so that the proper talent can be challenged, like it can be channeled to a different purpose where, well, you know, we can all finish the train of thought. So I was wondering, do you think that there may be, you know, not just undermining of democracy, but maybe there are other things at stake here?
I think, but that's a long story. It's not a new one.
No.
So the whole concept of elite universities, like in the English-speaking world, primarily they are like best known and most visible, is precisely that, to allow for the perpetuation of certain classes, social classes. So you enter these universities, you know, you join some bizarre clans, you know, or clubs, gentlemen's clubs, used to be called that way. Now, I suppose, is more diversified. And then, you know, if you are from those rich families, either businesses or political elites, you know, you go through. I'm sure can think of particular individuals who occupy or have occupied high positions in the U.S. establishment, but also Britain, but also anywhere really, who actually went to those schools. You know, probably I wouldn't really be sure that they know how to read and write properly, but in their native language. But they went through the school and participated in those manifestations and clubs precisely to the purpose of that is not to really educate them, but to expose them to a social context, environment, establish certain personal alliances and relationships, and that prepares you for actually taking later important government jobs or other types of jobs. That's called democracy,
jobs,
by the way.
You do need actual knowledge, though.
Yes.
So this is, I think
yes.
So I think what I'm trying to get at is the fact, for example, like I taught Russian at a very elite school in the United States for many years. Nobody learned to speak Russian. And then I was teaching for the US Army, was making Russian speakers like this. So when the knowledge is needed, someone is ready to produce it, but some other, then it's good. You can be a consumer, you can take Russian for several years, learn nothing, have a fancy degree. So there's still like some kind of need for knowledge.
Right, but that's what I refer to as this expert knowledge training.
Right.
So you need, the industry needs people who are trained in certain, you need IT people, you know, to advance, you know, algorithms, whatever. They need, you know, it cannot be somebody who doesn't know to do that, you know, it's just, you know, you need to train them. You need people who know, let's say, legal sphere. If you want to manipulate laws or lobbyist groups or something, you need that. And for that, you need good education. But let's think again about that. That good education doesn't mean anything else but training in a certain field. And if you're strictly speaking, you know, it's not education in this traditional or humanist sense, where you are able, for example, to critically think. Because if you start to critically think, you'll probably get an idea what am I doing? What am I doing participating, in a major criminal organization, called whatever, government organization, military or something, and I'm actually perpetuating a system of tremendous violence that actually destroys countries, people, lives, entire planet, by the way. Many scientists participating in discoveries of, chemicals that actually are polluting, destroying planet. Is that the education? And it can be elite in this sense that you are the best chemist there, and you know best how to fight certain kinds of microbes that actually in the long run will make more harm than good. But is that education? Is that something that we want to have? I think it's that kind of education, even when it's high level but is very narrow and is a training, can actually be very harmful.
For societies, for individual companies, it can be very beneficial. They profit quite a lot.
Any more? Samir?
Yeah, I think this is very thought-provoking. I'm, as a historian, of course, I'm working on the history of education. I've done some research, and I'm currently in a research project on the establishment of early Latin education, the creation of the monastic schools that later developed into the school system that we have. It was triggered by actually a doctoral student of mine, who's now a professor in the States, who realized that in the Latin educational system that was created in the monasteries and then developed into universities, rules were extremely important. The daily reading of the rule in the monastery. Education was to fit the system, whatever system it was. You were educated to fit the system, and then the system will feed you. So there is an exchange. You fit the system, and the system feeds you one way or other. And compared to classical education, as far as we know it, the classical paideia, and some of what we see in the earliest strata of the development of Christian education in general, there was, as an opposite to that, an emphasis on being a stranger. And then I started to think of, is this the fear of being a stranger, of not fitting, the fear of difference that has been highlighted by several philosophers, that we have a fear of difference. We want all to be alike and everybody to be like. There is a very basic, say, ideological thinking here that needs the corrective of the importance of the stranger. And of course, I don't have an answer to how to develop that, but I think something has to do with this idea of education, the purpose of education, to make you a stranger rather than fit the system.
I, as you know, from my anarchist background and thinking, philosophy, that I agree with that 100%. But there is, I think, that's why I don't think it needs to be reduced to just individual level. Like, okay, every once in a while, someone will be, whatever, crazy enough or something, don't have anything else to do in their lives or something, and then they will just start making trouble and disagree and stuff like that. But I think precisely that if we had a meaningful system of education, its purpose would be to take people out of their comfort zones, because what you're saying is perfectly applicable. That people like to socialize, they like to be liked. Most of them, some don't, but they like to share, to be part of a certain environment and fit it. And many people just want to do that and stay as invisible as possible. But if we had a meaningful system of education, its purpose precisely would be counter this consumerist culture and this contemporary madness where you're just supposed to stay where you are, isolated, locked, socially, psychologically, in every possible respect, and then serve the system as such. Through the education, actually more individuals, I would claim, could be put in those challenging situations where they would in a way be forced to rethink this and ask themselves seriously, is this social conformity the best way the most meaningful way to live our lives. And I think if people seriously confronted that issue, more people would actually, if they had an incentive from a system like system of education that can perfectly well afford to do that, if people wanted to do it, then the results would be very different. Because seriously, when people would be faced with a choice, okay, am I really, do I want to be a stupid idiot who just serves the current capitalist system, fits the power structure, feeds that, and that's the purpose of my life, that I consume, I don't, give very little back and stuff like that? Or is it better to actually creatively develop, to develop capacities that we have, to challenge things, to challenge ourselves, our thoughts, our concepts, our habits, our values, and that bring that in this academic environment and share it with other people, and then something else can come out of it. I think more people would actually choose the latter option. I'm not sure if that would be still the majority, but still more than we have. But the system is designed that it precisely prevents that. The academic tradition, as you just mentioned, is about socializing. It's about just repetition of what's been there and repetition of whatever is there, disciplines and hierarchies and stuff like that. And the business model that we live in actually just exactly precisely hates that. That people might start thinking, might start doing something for themselves. It wants to eliminate it. That's why neoliberal academia is there.
And an Ethiopian scholar, Yirga Wildayes, just read his book because he's looking at traditional Ethiopian education in relation to modern education, and sees quite, I think it's an interesting analysis of some of the important differences. And one thing that, of course, is very problematic is that he recognizes that printing is a problem because with books and reading, we are, so to say, made into copies of what we read, whereas oral teaching somehow develops a personal touch to everything that is done, because when you just hear things and you can't repeat them by reading them, you will gradually develop them into something of your own and not making yourself a copy of it. So he comes to the very odd conclusion that reading and printing books and writing is one of the biggest problems of education.
Yeah, well, that's an old argument. Why Socrates and Jesus said they refused to write? But I think that's of course there is something to that. But I think the overwhelming evidence is against that. There is because we do think differently when we read alone and when we, for example, write, as opposed to when we communicate. And one indication of that is that the length, if you think about the length of your average thought when you speak, it is much shorter. And the grasp of concept is actually much more focused than when you read, for instance, and then all sorts of things go on in your head. So my argument would be that actually reading stimulates imagination. It actually opens up concept. Now, the danger is if it becomes too autistic.
Yeah.
If you are just
mass reading.
Yes, and you just sit and you just read your, something, and you lose any connection with the environment. You don't know how to talk to other people anymore, or you start believing that abstract concepts can actually replace experiences, with other people, environments, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a pretty bizarre conclusion. Actually, I think what is needed is to supplement reading by all sorts of other creative practices.
Okay, I have a question. Yeah. To continue with, I think that critique is not the highest level of academia. Actually, I think that it's relating to people with our opinions and values and ideas and so on. Now, I'm trying to get to understand. You say the Western democratic countries, so to say. But what is the non-Western countries? Or what is non-Western democracy at all? And how would that relate to your idea about the collapse of education systems. And
oh yeah, there are many examples we can cite, and that's another. And thanks for that, because it's another indication of the level of indoctrination we are submerging. So we automatically associate first of all liberal democracy with democracy, which is ideal in the state, and second, the Western, meaning primarily, whoever is in the orbit of the major imperial power in the West. So it used to be, there's a sequence of them, France, Great Britain, United States. So their sphere of political interest and alliances is what we call West. What happens to join that alliance is West. What happens not to be that part of that alliance is not West. Okay, so it's a political concept, but you can find outside of that paradigm tremendously interesting projects that actually are some kinds of democracy. Think of, I think I can use the most standard examples. Of course, you can object to them many things, but we can think of many traditional African, prior to the colonial expansion communities. We can think of North American communities that functioned very differently before the time of colonization extermination. We can think of alternative models within Western countries, but that don't follow a liberal democratic paradigm, such as anarchist communities during the Spanish War, such as self-management attempts to develop in various socialist countries. South American context extremely interesting for that. So they're all over the paradigms, but because of the predominance of one imperial idea, very aggressive, we are supposed to forget about, that humans lived on this planet for a very long period of time and developed many sophisticated things and many much more humane than we have nowadays. We actually chose very often to simply destroy all of that and impose certain ideas, such as that the pinnacle of human civilization is what we call liberal democracy, very absurd.
So liberal democracy, that's your definition of Western democracies.
That's the predominant model that's propagated, that has its roots in the mainstream liberalism, and in the meantime has become, since the 19th century, the default ideology that the capitalist system relied on up until very, very late.
What is the alternative to liberal democracies?
Is more authentic democracy. And if you want to go in that direction, I think the successor, those who actually followed on the liberal spirit of early liberalism, is not what we call liberalism. That has become a conservative ideology of big businesses. The successor of the liberal spirit of liberalism is socialism and anarchism. Much more freedom-oriented, much more democratic ideologies that actually can think the world in which private property and markets are not all that there is in human lives.
And the main problem with liberalism is?
The main problem is that it became the default ideology of the capitalist system.
So liberalism is just an outside of capitalism. That's what you're trying to say.
It's the ideological context, is the framework, ideological project, which enabled capitalism to establish itself as a dominant system.
If someone would have an understanding of liberalism as a kind of positive force, how would you be able to address that from the perspective you have presented?
As I just said, I would say, well, yeah, there was a liberal spirit, early liberalism, and we can understand it with its context. We can understand the arguments by Locke, very meaningful within his context, and we can understand why insisting on private property at that time made sense, because that was the only way to actually legitimize the new class against the established order of power at that time. But the problem, this very thing that was emancipatory at that time, became oppressive later on when the new class established itself. So yeah, we can go back and understand the liberal spirit of early liberalism and then see what happened to that. And what happened to that is that there are ideologies such as socialism and anarchism and all the variations in between.
Can liberalism be non-oppressive?
Yeah, I mean, that's an ideology, can anything be non-oppressive? Yeah, sure. I mean, it depends how you understand it. And that's why I make it between the mainstream approach to liberalism that culminates into these things that I just quoted from the left and or second half of the 20th century. But if you go back, you'll find, of course, many different authors and many different definitions of liberalism. In one sense, you could claim that socialism is liberalism at its best, but it's certainly not what we mean by liberalism in the mainstream discourse. It's certainly not a Rawlsian liberalism. It's certainly not liberalism of whoever, the 20th century thinkers. That's not what it is. because that is something that actually thinks of the public sphere from a very particular perspective, with certain ideas, could not divorce itself from the predominance of private property and everything else that went into it, and was focused primarily on personalized power that it fought very well to its credit. But that's not all that there is in social context. So what depends, yeah, you can of course define things, it's just a question, can communism be used in a positive sense? Yeah, sure, some people use it here very positively, others very negatively. So.
Okay. Thank you so much for attending this lecture. Thank you.